We are live.
Hey, good morning, all. Welcome to the Vote Common Good podcast and live stream. It's Wednesday, March 24th, and I'm Doug Pagitt. Wednesday means that it's Faith Leader Conversation Day, Common Good Faith around here. So joined by our regular gang, and we're in full force today. So it's very good to see all of you. And all of you that are watching on the live stream, let us know where you are and what it is that you're doing today. We just love to know that people are doing all the things that we do in our worlds. And I'm Doug Pagitt. I'm in Minneapolis, standing up. Today, I'm making a habit out of this. So let us know where you are and what it is that you're doing. Because on this podcast, we try to encourage you to make the common good your call to your life, your call to your faith, your call to your political understanding, that we pursue the common good in all things. And so we like to have an open-eyed, and we say this every day we start this podcast, we want this open-eyed view, meaning we want to see all the things, but then also hold to some hope. Right? That's the thing we're called to. We don't want our hope to make us not see. We want our hope to sharpen our vision, to widen our vision, to help us see even more. So we want to have this open-eyed and hopeful view toward what's happening in the world and what we can do, how we can let our own light shine, how we can engage in the common good. So on Wednesdays, we talk about faith with faith leaders that are with us today. Today, we're going to delve into the very difficult and real topic of violence and gun violence in our culture and society. We'll get to that in a bit. But we're joined by our regular cast of pastoring friends, and one of those is Stephany Spaulding. Good morning, Stephany.
Good morning, Doug. Good morning, Dominique and Laura, all of our listeners and viewers, depending on what platform you are using this Wednesday morning. It is a faithful morning, and we are grateful that you are with us. I am here coming out of Colorado Springs, pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, and again, just here to talk about the hope and faith, how we are all connected in some way as we look at the world around us and live in this world around us. Laura, so good to see you this morning. Take it away.
Yeah, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for listening with us on this Wednesday, this Hump Day Wednesday. Laura Truax here, pastor at LaSalle Street Church in Chicago, on a morning where it's bright outside. There's hope springing up from the ground and meeting us in the skies. And yet we come with a degree of heaviness and a degree of responsibility, I think, as faith leaders. So glad you're in this conversation with us. Passing it to you, Dominique.
Hey, Dominique Gilliard coming to you from Conyers, Georgia, and am excited to be with you this morning. Coming expectantly for a rich, robust conversation. But as Laura alluded to, really coming to you a little heavy with me and Stephany both kind of being in cities or states that have been directly impacted by these conversations that we're going to have today. And we'll delve into that a little bit more later on.
Yeah, it's a difficult, heavy time, isn't it? We're in the midst of another national conversation about gun violence because in the last 10 days, there have been 2 mass shootings that have caused mass casualties. And, look, the problem with all of this is that we can all run through a litany in our memories of the places and the people, right? You can start naming the country music festivals and the churches and the mosques and the synagogues and the schools and the elementary schools and the movie theaters and the grocery stores and time and the parks and the shootings that have happened in all of these places. And it has become so commonplace in the last 2 decades for us to have conversation that we all know the conversation sets that people are going to engage in. And one of our questions today, somebody said to me, Steph, and I'll throw it over to you, but somebody said to me, who's a big fan of this, of our Wednesday Faithful Conversations, said, "Oh, you guys are talking about gun violence this morning. Why is that a faith leader conversation, or how are faith leaders going to address this?" And it's kind of an interesting question, right? Because we know the roles that certain people play in this conversation. It's like there's some perverse script that gets played out, and that's one of the things I think that we do have to address. And for faith leaders and for pastors and clergy and others to not just stay in our lane as people might want us to, but to speak more broadly.
And I think it is an interesting question for a number of reasons, ones that you have already articulated, but also it immediately begs me to wonder, are there not enough faith leaders speaking to the question of gun violence in the United States? And again, the desire for guns and even the language of guns as people's God-given rights, and we can come back to that later on throughout the show. But it's been a really hard few days, particularly as a faith leader who stands on the side of the oppressed. So those who are the most vulnerable in society, those who are victimized by structural and institutional and individual powers, and to witness yet again this level of tragedy in a state that seems to come back time and time again to this kind of mass violence, right? Whether it's Columbine being one of the first, or Aurora movie theater shooting. Our children are definitely of a generation where they don't know a world without mass shooting. And so as a faith leader, working to hold people, right? To hold space and to reach out to individuals in community to make sure that they are well, even as ones, we might be processing the tragedy and the trauma ourselves, right? I know so many people who live not only in Boulder, but who are actively engaged in the work of gun violence prevention in Boulder. I'm looking, and Michael Doherty is an acquaintance of mine that I met as a candidate. So him being the DA in Boulder County, knowing the history of individuals that have worked really hard over the last 2.5, 3 years to get Boulder to the place where they actually banned assault weapons in the county, in the city, and then to be sued by the NRA and have a judge 10 days ago lift the ban. And now this, right? And it was that 10 days ago where the shooter went and purchased this pistol that was then, tricked out to become an assault weapon. So all of these different things are at play right now, and the closeness to home in which it hits in my spirit, as well as in the community of folks that I love, again, who are sacrificing their lives consistently, trying to create beloved community, right? Trying to create peaceful community. So when we ask the question about where faith leaders are, or why faith leaders are in the midst of this conversation, I think that we can't not be in the midst of this conversation if we are doing the work that really ministers healing to the souls of people. And the last thing I'll say is I saw a post yesterday, and it was grotesque as well as tragic, as well as revealing, like all the things. And it was just like, this is a sign that we are headed back to normal. Wow. So it was responding to the COVID pandemic, moving in the trajectory that it is moving. And then the tragedy of so much, and I don't want to, the familiarity of mass shooting in the United States. And again, it was the grossest, most revealing thing that I have seen recently.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's the utter unsurprising nature of another mass shooting, right? So yeah, two mass shootings in 10 days, not surprising to us. And frankly, I love Doug's opening statement that we are people of hope. Indeed, we are. We are people of hope. But for me, around gun safety, if 20 dead first graders does not move the dial on our national conversation on gun control, 20 dead first graders in 2012 in Sandy Hook Elementary School, children who were still making their B's backwards. If 20 dead 6-year-old bodies have not moved our conversation, there's a part of me that wonders it won't be moved. It simply won't be moved, or at least it will not be moved by the old conversations. We have got to have a new way of thinking about human flourishing, a new way of thinking about what do we mean by this beloved community, Stephany, that you referenced? What do we mean about building communities? And the manner in which it's commonplace, what that headline was pointing out. At the beginning of this podcast, I had to just check on what the statistics were in Chicago because, embarrassingly, I didn't know. I didn't know how many people had already been killed in Chicago in 2021. And I couldn't find that statistic readily. But what I did see was this past weekend, 20 were shot, 4 fatally in our city. And it's so commonplace that here I am sitting as a faith leader on the near north side, and I don't have those numbers readily at hand. I have 2 family members who killed themselves by guns. I have a community that has had people are currently in jail for murder that they have done with a gun. We sit on the border of a changing neighborhood that's had its own share of violence on our east and west. But it's not about being a changing neighborhood. It's about being any neighborhood in any city. And yeah, it's remarkably, the surprising thing is that it's unsurprising. Yeah. So
Any
eager to hear
city
how we're
and
going to
any
get there.
suburb. I mean,
Yeah.
and I think for me, going back to your question, Doug, about or the statement, what does this have to do with faith leaders? I think if we really take scripture seriously and the commission to seek the peace and prosperity of our communities, then anybody, particularly in cities, knows that gun violence is an issue. But I think, these mass shootings also are telling us that this is a profound issue in suburban communities too. And so one of the things that I really struggle with the tension is coming from a city like Chicago, how Chicago is always stigmatized, and let's talk about gun violence, but a particular type of gun violence. We need to have a more comprehensive concern about gun violence, that is gun violence that talks about urban gun violence and these mass shootings, suburban gun violence, a more comprehensive, robust concern about the issue of gun violence, period, and violence in general. And, we've talked a lot on this podcast about race, and the violence that happened in Atlanta can't be disconnected from that conversation. And we really have to understand the historic manifestation of anti-Asian violence in this nation. And most of us really don't know that narrative. And so, I would highly recommend a book called Driven Out that looks at how the Chinese in the U.S. have been forcefully driven out of over 40 cities in our country's history. And I mean, forcefully with violence, deadly violence sometimes. And I think, when we look at things like hot button conversations today, like immigration, again, we have to understand the role that Asian Americans have played in our history of immigration legislation and the violence of the the Chinese Exclusionary Act, where we excluded a group of people just because of their ethnic identity from immigrating into our country, initially for 10 years, but ultimately extended to 60 years. We have to understand the violence of the Japanese internment camps, which I call incarceration camps because that's what they were. We have to understand the violence of incidents like Vincent Chin, where you had somebody going out to celebrate his essentially bachelor party before getting married in the Motor City. And because of layoffs, you have white men who felt entitled to certain jobs who were stigmatizing Asian Americans as the reason why they were losing their jobs, and then go and beat his brains out with the bat and kill him violently, again, coming back to this theme of violence. But what undergirds it is this notion of Asian Americans as perpetual foreigners, people who can never truly be trusted, never truly become U.S. citizens, never truly be equitably seen as members and contributing parts of our society. And I think while you can look at that sociologically, politically, I think the church is tasked with looking at that theologically and really looking at this question of the Imago Dei and what does it have to say to us about these anti-Asian sentiments that are not just existing, but thriving in our country and really have been latently existing really since the 1800s in ways. And so what does it mean for us that we have not escalated the conversation within the body of Christ so that we aren't allowed to cling to narratives like that? Because let's really be sober about the fact that the man who went out and killed these people was a pastor's child. And so this is something that is alive and well within congregations, and we have disconnected from our theology and our understanding of who God has created us to be and how God has commissioned us to engage in the world. And I think we really have to go back and have a sober assessment of what we are teaching and how we are discipling people where they believe that they can cling to these kind of worldly logic and still believe that they're abiding in Christ because they're incongruent with one another.
And I think we can't, I appreciate all that you have shared, Dominic. I think we also cannot deny the masculinist relationship to the kind of violence that we are seeing as it relates to gun violence. And that is on a mass level, as well as individual intimate partner violence, homicide, suicide. White males are one of the highest demographics to die by gun violence and suicide. So what is it also for us to raise the question about the constructions and understanding of masculinity that lends itself to these kinds of responses, right? Like problem solving, like this is the way in which problems are solved for a number of men in our society, that cuts across race. And I'm not denying the racial connections as well, because they're definitely there, but there's also these very gendered connections to this particular kind of violence that happens. And again, as spiritual bodies, and Laura was saying in the pre-show, it cuts across religion, right? The way that violence is used to resolve conflict is so much a part of different practices, spiritual, religious practices, that it is, again, we cannot keep having the same conversations, but we have to dig deeper in some of these conversations that we have been glossing over. So,
for sure. And I want to real quick, I really want to affirm kind of what you're saying in regards to the masculinity. And I want to really problematize the way in which we talk about, white fragility a lot. There's really male fragility in the way in which I remember it was the Gillette commercial that came out, and it was really trying to, trouble the waters around masculinity. And the response was swift and it was strong, really trying to shut down these conversations about what is toxic masculinity and why shouldn't we be concerned about it, and why is this overplaying or over dramatizing things. And, I see this really having a foothold in the church and in the body of Christ, where we don't really want to have an honest conversation around toxic masculinity and its implications for the body and the world. And when we see these scandals after scandals of male religious leaders being caught up in these, inappropriate relationships, just to be general, and we see, the normativity of the statistics around, things like sexual assault on college campuses. And we saw the numbers of intimate partner violence, but also child abuse with COVID skyrocket when people were forced to be in their own homes. There's an urgent need to have this conversation. This is one of the topics that I really raise up in my forthcoming book, and really try to say, like, what does it look like for us to have these conversations in the church as the body and hold one another accountable? Because at the end of the day, these are discipleship issues. How we see our sisters, how we treat our sisters, how we abuse our male privilege are all conversations about discipleship. Just like the abuse of racial privilege is a discipleship issue, the same thing is true when it comes to this subject of male privilege. So I wanted to underscore what you're saying and really affirm that element of the conversation that needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think that gets into that pivot into it's a discipleship issue. I think that's where the real intersection is, right? I mean, we talk about human flourishing, we talk about being people embedded in community, the church existing for the sake of others, all those things, absolutely true. But at the core of who we are as believers is the question: does our relationship with Jesus mediate our positions on all things? Or is it a privatized faith that deals with maybe how I operate in the confines of my home as a mother? Or does it impact how I spend my money, how I vote for candidates, how I engage in the public square? I mean, that's really the crux of what Jesus came to do. He came to embody himself in all aspects of our lives. And to do that, I feel like that's where, going back to what Stephany said on the front end, clergy, we have let our people down. I think we have failed to really unpack this violent strain that goes through our entire Judeo-Christian tradition. From early in the Bible, where we have some really hard texts to deal with around genocide, alienating the stranger, right? Annihilating entire other groups of people. Those texts are in there, and we've got to talk about it. We've got to unpack it. We've got to help people understand the context. And we have to march through the entire text of the Bible into the language of Jesus, into what does he mean when he tells, put away the sword, into what does it mean to be a minority faith in the midst of the Roman Empire. We haven't done a good job.
Empire.
Right.
A violent Roman Empire, exactly. So, and the fact that Jesus comes as a marginalized Jew in that empire, right? So we've abdicated that responsibility, I think. And so our people take their cues from the voices in the world, right? Rather than having everything mediated through the person of Jesus. So, Doug, I think you've got some text queued up for us maybe to look at on this, right?
Yeah, I was thinking about some of that. There's these texts that tell these Jesus narratives, right? And there's one where just before Jesus's arrest, And as a part of the arrest and what's going to become the crucifixion, which was a first century version of what we would call lynching in our day, that Jesus is arguing with his disciples about how they should behave. And there's this little text that's from Matthew 26. Some people will recognize. In fact, it'll come up in the next few weeks if you follow some Lenten reading, because right now the Christian church is telling the story of the Passion Week of Jesus, which is often glorified in a way that's rather dangerous to us. That we could reimagine what's happening in the Passion narrative, that it's societal and personal and ethical as well as it is theological. But so this little text says, Jesus says to the person who's coming to arrest him, do what it is you came for. So this is saying to Judas and so on that he should turn Jesus in. And then the men step forward, the passage goes on to read, to seize Jesus and to arrest him. And with that, one of Jesus's companions, Peter, drew out his sword and swung it and struck the man in the side of the head, cutting off his ear. Jesus said, "Put your sword back in its place, for all who draw the sword will die by the sword." And it's one of these passages that certainly people like me, who are a pacifist in this world and think that our Christian ethic calls us to love our neighbor as the second commandment, should outweigh any Second Amendment right to bear arms to defend yourself, right? In my view, we are called to the second commandment above the Second Amendment. And I think a lot of people struggle with their Christian identity and holding that so closely without the ethical and moral demands that identity offers to you and puts on you and asks you to consider your humanity in the midst of it. So you get this conflict. And then there's another passage right in that same bit out of a different book. And here's the Theological Argument, right? Where Jesus says, hey, count up your swords. And they say, well, we have 2. And he says, well, then that's good. And I watch my gun rights friends say, no, Jesus says you should make sure you have the weapons of war to operate in this world. And so people like me will make the argument that Jesus teaches to put the sword away because that's a pathway of death. And I would equate the sword of the first century with the personalized weapons of our day. And other people say, no, Jesus actually teaches people to double their amount. Don't just have 1, but have 2. And I've watched pastors preach that to their people. So we have competing demands happening in our world when it comes theologically. And look, a lot, when was the last time any of us really said, what I want to do is really focus in on Matthew 26 verses 50 through 52, where Jesus says, put the sword up. Like, people don't want to, they don't want to navigate in these waters. And yet it's like, it's in there for a reason, right? There's a false arrest, false accusations, the state killing a person for political gain. All of that is happening. There's interpersonal violence. Jesus is speaking to these issues. And yet most of us don't think about the Easter week in that context, right? We've been, for those who have eyes to see and ears to hear, I guess, right? To recognize that these passages could be spoken of in these ways. And I'll just say one more thing about this, and that is that this doesn't need to be political. What has made it political is that the two political parties have generally sided on one side of this issue or the other.
Yes.
And what do religious leaders do when an issue that is moral and ethical and is about not loving your politics, but about loving your neighbor has been created as a partisan divide? Well, I think we have to name that, speak out about it, and not say to ourselves, we're not being political, say we're being precisely political. And but that doesn't mean that we have to just play by the partisan, this side, that side rules. But look, people who hold the views that I hold, that we should get rid of weapons in this society and try to move toward a weapon-free society, are clearly in the minority, right? So from top to bottom, that is an argument that's all that remains as the fringy minority view, but I think it's the Jesus view personally.
And I think we. Do you want to go, Laura?
Well, just a real quick corrective to that, Doug. Yes, perhaps the minority of a weaponless society, but the number of people who want gun safety laws is a majority, and we've got to just name that.
That's right.
It's what is the number now? 67%, 65%. I mean, so I think there's a lot of people who believe this love affair with violence and lax gun laws have gone amok, and that we've got to attend to this. So just a quick word on that.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, Stephanie. Yeah.
No, absolutely. And we can see it in the political structure of our country that more and more people are advocating for sensible regulations on the possession and the sale and the trafficking of arms in our society. But we have a political structure that doesn't want to move on it, not going to shift the conversation to the dismantling of the filibuster. So senators actually have to take a vote and a stance or what have. But that's there. But, come back for VCG's Politics Day.
That's right.
But
Tuesdays we'll talk about ending that filibuster. That's for sure.
Right. But I do want to come back to this conversation of the politicizing of faith, particularly in this place that we call the United States. And I use that phraseology directly and specifically because for Indigenous people, this place is not the United States, right? And there's a history to that. But when you have a nation primarily constructed on a theoretical position of manifest destiny, and that it is your God-given ability to possess and to dominate space and to dominate people. And part of that domination is by any means necessary through very violent means, genocidal means. I don't know unless there is a new majority. I don't know any other way to separate the politicization of faith or faith from politics in that way, and how violence operates in our country, because it's so ingrained in the foundational notions of who people perceive they are as Americans, right? And I'm talking predominantly white men who perceive the way that they are most patriotic, the way that they are most American is to invest in this violent possession and practice of Americanness, right? From frontiers to missionary conquering to all of the ways that we, who we uplift, the Daniel Boones to, the Battle of Hidalgo, all of it is so rooted in, and the sale and the use and the practice of having arms is not separate from that. So I just want to call that out. I also want to point to a number of our viewers and the comments that they are making. Kurt says, I think a lot of people feel like they need a gun to feel safe, but it's because others are walking around willy-nilly with them. So again, this practice of faith and what safety and protection looks like, and whether or not we have to invest in arms in order to create what is safety, as opposed to teaching the ways in which we build community, we build trust, we build safety that looks very much differently. And then lastly, I do want to uplift, and I think we'll have time to come back to different organizations, but I do want to uplift organizations that are doing the work that Doug points to about moving towards an armless society, a peace-centered society that deals with not just the way guns are used, but how as human beings are we honoring one another's humanity in the way that we address conflict. So I do sit on, a shameless plug, I sit on the board of Raw Tools Inc. And the uniqueness of this organization is that they believe scripturally, theologically, in turning swords into plowshares. That is their work. They are blacksmiths that take donated guns and transform them into garden tools and works of art. But they also take and collect the narratives of that pain to transform people who have been impacted by the violence, by gun violence, and to transform that pain into something that is powerful and life producing, as well as plotting for peace, right? Teaching ways that we can resolve conflict that is not through mechanisms of violence. So there are a number of organizations out there. I know the work that Shane Claiborne does and others that really is like, how do we plot for peace?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let me just, Dominique, can I just add one comment before you jump there? Sometimes numbers and statistics are helpful. Sometimes they help us build facts that help lead us to truth. And I just want, I've spent a little time in the last few days sort of getting my head around the numbers, because I keep hearing two different things. One is to say, and I heard this on MSNBC last night, right? You have senators saying, every time there's a mass shooting, we get somebody wanting to change gun laws. And then Al Franken was on the show and he said, we don't do it every time there's a mass shooting. There were 387 mass shootings last year and 362 the year before.
There you go.
And then you Google how many mass shootings there are. And you'll get two different numbers. You'll get 387 and you'll get 2 in a year. What we do with this term mass shootings is some people call a mass shooting when there's a certain number of deaths that are not family related. That's called a mass shooting. So other people call a mass shooting when numbers of people are shot, but not necessarily killed, or it includes domestic violence. So there's a number of websites, we'll put them in the show notes and tag them here, that if you just Google like mass shooting numbers, you'll find these statistics, and lots of news articles have these, that we have a categorization struggle in our society about what we call acceptable and newsworthy and what we say is not. And we do something that's very important when it's a stranger in a mass environment that kills 10 or 6 or 8 or 12 people. Then there's something different when that happens in a family. So a number of the mass shootings with high fatality rates are domestic violence. And oftentimes children. The number of children killed by weapons is not drive-by shootings from, in certain cities. It's domestic violence, and it ranges in the hundreds, approaching the thousands. So there are what we're going to talk about as an epidemic of mass shootings is even something we can't seem to agree on. Right. And what we're going to do in response to it, and just trying to get our heads around the 40,000 plus people who die every year by guns in this country is an enormous number. 2020, pandemic year, when we all say, boy, we had a lull. I don't know if you felt that, but the news stories certainly were a lull. There were more mass shootings in 2020 than in any year that we've had. It was the most mass shooting year. If you use the statistics of people taking a weapon and shooting multiple people, and then you get into this other thing about what the media is going to cover. I'm not blaming the media at all. I'm just saying, even to have the conversation that we want to have, we already know, and Dominique and Laura and Stephany, you've done such a brilliant job of threading into this tapestry the other threads that have to be in our narrative, right? They're so crucial, and that's why we don't talk about the right conversations. But then when it comes just down to like, how many deaths are there? How many shootings? How many perpetrators? Even there, we argue and we disagree in this society about everything around this. And it almost feels to me like we need another way to talk about all these issues that brings in the complexity and somehow gets to something that we can at least share the same fact set on. So sorry about that interruption, but it seems really important to me that we recognize how difficult these conversations are for us to have in this society because of the way we've constructed the discussion around it.
Yeah, a couple
I
quick
think
thoughts.
Dominique was gonna, yeah.
Yeah, just a couple quick thoughts. I'm trying to put them all back together. So I wanted to highlight kind of like what you were doing, Stephany. Really, because one of the things, kind of like the reactionary thing you were just talking about, Doug, we hear this a lot whenever there is a police involved shooting in an urban context. Folks say, well, why don't you care about gun violence that happens in your community all the time? Folk who live in these communities know that that's not true. There are people consistently doing activism, trying to mobilize to decrease guns on the streets in our communities. So I wanted to highlight orgs like PICO and Lifelines to Healing. Shout out to my brothers, Ben and Mike McBride out in the Bay Area, really doing the hard work, leading the way in that. But I really want to talk about, and when we talk about this, let's just... I don't want to... I'll just use the word of addiction. This addiction to kind of guns, I think a lot of it is rooted in fear. And I think when we talk about a lot of this, I think we don't name the power of fear in the way that we really should. Even like the comment that you lifted up, Stephany, the guy said, I feel like I have to have a gun because folk are walking around willy-nilly. That comes from the fact that given of what we're talking about and what we seem to be true, there is this real fear that I need to have something that can ultimately protect me because I know what happens or theoretically, I think I know what will happen if I don't. And I think we really have to name the power of fear and how it seduces us into really worldly logics that don't align themselves or aren't rooted in kind of biblical truths. And I really, even with what you were talking about this Lenten season, I mean, when we talk about the triumphal entry, there was this hope that Jesus was going to come in as this militaristic commander and come and reinstate the power of the nation state. And Jesus chooses not to. But there was this fear that people were projecting what Jesus should be, what Jesus needed to be, out of the fear of what they've experienced, what they saw, what they were feeling. And I think that has direct parallels for this conversation that we're having today. There is this fear that drives us to desire, to cling to think of strategies that are rooted in worldly logics, but aren't part of the kingdom ecology. And I think we really have to press into, particularly during these high kind of liturgical seasons, about what is the deeper meaning of these little subtle things that Jesus chooses to do and things that people desire Jesus to do, but Jesus chose not to do because Jesus's kingdom is not of this world. It is something different. It is something beyond the logics of this world. And how are we as people who are commissioned to follow a savior of a peaceable kingdom called to try to strive towards that in the midst of a violent world? So I just got asked to write an article for PAX, which is an org that is really being run by Michelle Reyes and some other folk. Shout out to her and the Asian American Christian Collaborative that's doing really important work right now. And she asked me to talk about how do we pursue systemic change in a violent world? How do we non-violently pursue systemic change in a violent world? And I think, one of the things that we really need to name in this conversation about violence is most of what we deem as violent is actually a response to violence. We don't actually talk about the initial act of violence that causes the response, but we demonize and stigmatize the response to violence. And one of the best articulations of this is Angela Davis. She was interviewed in a documentary called the Black Power Mixtape. And she's talking about growing up in Birmingham, which was nicknamed Bombingham because of how often bombs were set off in Black communities. And the interviewer asked her, does she believe in violence? And she says, the fact that you asked me that question as someone who grew up in a community where bombs went off weekly just as a form of intimidation and to try to remind us of where our place is. The fact that I live next door to one of the 4 little girls who was killed in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. The fact that these things, this is the way that we think about this question, how we resist institutional, systemic, state-sanctioned violence sometimes, but we stigmatize the way that I respond to it as the violent act, shows the faulty logic we have in this conversation and why we're never really going to get down to the deep roots of what we need to get to if we're going to really excavate what really is causing violence and causing kind of even the violent responses that sometimes manifest themselves in response to violence. But I think the first thing we need to do is we need to cultivate eyes to see the initial act of violence. Stephany raised up a number of them when she talked about, these theories of manifest destiny, all these different things. But there is an initial form of violence that needs to be analyzed and unpacked before we jump to demonizing and vilifying folk who are trying to respond to systemic institutional violence, even state-sanctioned violence at times, like I raised up with the Japanese internment camps where 120,000 people were rounded up and forcefully removed from their home and put into these camps. So just wanted to raise that.
And that's, and you can go on with the death penalty as well, right? Again,
For sure.
State-sanctioned violence. We've got several threads going on right here. And it does feel like while we get to that essential spot, right? What's that initial presenting motivation of violence and the response to it? At the same time, I think there are things we can do corporately as a society to at least confront some of these massive deaths that we continue to have. And frankly, every conversation I've been in around gun safety, I keep bringing up this idea. I'm going to bring it up again. It doesn't seem to ever go anywhere. But for the life of me, I don't understand why we don't employ the force of capitalism around our conversation of gun safety. So, for instance, there is enormous profits to be made by the insurance industry if we simply require all gun owners to insure their weapon. Bang, right? We have 300 million guns out in circulation. That's a lot of weapons to be needing to be insured. And we create laws around owning a gun, like owning a car. And I know that that's part of the conversation, that for our Second Amendment rights, we can't have any kind of restrictions on gun ownership, and therefore requiring insurance would be an undue burden. But that's the kind of conversation that I think we could start having, because I think you bring moneyed interest into these conversations and they start moving. It moves out of the kind of softish morality of 21st graders dead and the number keep ticking year after year after year. If our consciences are not moved, which they don't really seem to be moved, let's bring in moneyed interest, because we are sure interested in making money. We're sure interested in sitting at the center of capitalism. So maybe that's a very pragmatic kind of insertion into the conversation, but it feels like that's also where faith leaders need to be. It's very pragmatic, as innocent as doves and as wise as serpents, right?
Yeah, and that conversation has been on the table for organizations like Moms Demand and different political lobbying organizations around the insurance for guns, or the insurance for life that is lost because your firearm is used in a particular way.
Yes.
Someone asked in the chat for me to share the name of that organization again. It's called Raw Tools, RAWTOOLS, Raw Tools Inc. And again, their work is to take donated guns. A lot of them come from people who have had their lives impacted by gun violence, both victim and victimizer, who are turning in their guns so that they can be transformed into garden tools. I also, I think another piece of this conversation, because I actually love that documentary. If you all haven't seen the Black Power mixtape document, I use it, I teach it in class or what have you. It's a really powerful documentary about the Black Power movement and some footage that was lost, by this Swedish company. But also looking at the history in which gun legislation and quote unquote control comes into existence, right? So we have a rise, and there's this difficult tension that sits at the crux of what Dominique is saying, like the original harms, right? And not excavating the original harms. We have a rise in the late 60s for advocacy. The NRA comes into being for advocacy to ensure that guns are kept out of Black and brown communities, right? Because the Panthers are very much utilizing the Second Amendment for their protection from state-sanctioned violence. And you have white legislators, white communities, white organizing, white business owners who say that is not, the Second Amendment is not for Black people to uphold and to be armed likewise. And so a lot of what we see in the production and the existence of the NRA comes as a response to racism, right? Like they want to uphold racist practices and make sure that Black and brown community are not armed and equipped in the same way. And I know that we talked a lot about the Atlanta shooting, but also want to navigate the nuances of the ways in which race and faith are playing out, even in Colorado, right? Like the almost collective white Christian sigh of relief when the shooter's Arabic name is released. Yes. And his, connection to Islam is made for viewers who are watching around the country, and they're like, oh, well, this is not a white guy. And clearly I need to do a whole podcast on the construct of race and how you could be Muslim from Syria and white, that's a whole nother conversation. But
American, how about it? And
American, right? So there's that. But then there is also, again, and I don't know if others felt it in the way that I did just yesterday, again, with CNN reporting or what have you, is how these white Christians really released because they could point the finger at Islam, right? And say, oh, he's a terrorist. So that is something different than these other mass shootings that we have experienced in recent weeks, years, months, or what have you. And I'm just like, if we as faith leaders don't say something and do better, it really is incumbent upon us to speak to the ways that original harm is so percolating at the root of a lot of what we are seeing play out symptomatically.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think another example of that are the comments made by Ron Johnson, the senator from Wisconsin, right? When he talks about how the January 6th assault on the Capitol were well-meaning patriots, right? He would have been very frightened had it been BLM marchers. Again, the original racism at the heart of all of this, right, Stephany? Yeah. Sorry, Doug. Go ahead.
No problem. No problem at all. I just want to inject one other piece to this. When you have a gun violence conversation, you are having a violence conversation. And as we've articulated, you're having an American history conversation, a country well rooted in the use of violence for its means, from the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the internment of peoples, the devastation of using war to drive our economy, our prison system. Like, violence is something we don't believe we are in this country. We will say we are a peaceful people, and yet our history argues against that. And that's something we have to talk about, right? Without saying that you hate America or being claimed that you hate America, or somehow, speaking about the truths of who we are and whom we want to be, can feel like people are condemning America in a way that they, feel that they, are being oppositional to the notion of being an American. It's not true. In fact, my personal opinion is, if you're unwilling to tell the truth about someone or yourself, you probably aren't in love yet. Love allows you to tell the truth. Keeping lies, keeping hidden truths means that you have a conditional set of relationships. So you're only committed to something if you can continue the big lie. So that's absolutely important. And when you talk about guns in this country, it becomes a Second Amendment issue. And just for people who don't nerd around in this, I would just give a minute or so on this. There's been a debate from the founding of the country and from the founding of the Constitution about the role of weaponry held by the citizens. And it was a conversation about the militias and whether states, what most people understand militias from the 1700s to be articulated in what we would now call having a national guard in your own state. So take state militias and insert, the state can have its own army, but it can't use its army outside of its own borders, right? It can use it for its own purposes. So that conversation had been going on, and guns were highly restricted and was not violating individual rights. But there was a big movement and a big push from the 1970s forward that culminated in 2008 when the Supreme Court ruled in a case that's called University of Delaware versus Heller, often referred to as the Heller decision, that the Second Amendment does not only speak of militias, it speaks of individuals' rights to own weapons to defend themselves. Yeah. That was, for the history of this country, a fringe opinion. It became the 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court, and now is the law of the land. And if you wonder why we cannot restrict certain guns, like Stephany brought up, that Boulder wanted to have a ban on certain kinds of weapons, and it was overruled by a judge, it's because the Heller decision of the Supreme Court in 2008 satisfied their argument by saying that the placement of the comma in the Second Amendment says that there's two arguments being made. One is militias, and the other is an individual's right to bear arms. It all hung on the placement and the meaning of the comma. Go on Wikipedia, look up Second Amendment, take 20 minutes to read it. It will blow your mind that there is a political and moral argument being advanced by this thing that has gone on in our society. So now the legal argument is you cannot restrict guns without having to argue against the Second Amendment. That is new, and part of the reason that laws are becoming more lax now is because the Supreme Court's decision. The Supreme Court has made bad decisions in its history, and it's made good ones. A lot of us believe this was a bad one. This will be overturned. This is going to be like the periods where the Supreme Court has been just profoundly morally and legally wrong, and they're going to have to change that at some point. But we are now in a situation where the laws will not allow the kinds of gun safety, common sense gun safety arguments without running up against some serious legal challenges. So until we can get to the point that the laws in the United States can be changed, and that's going to go back to the Supreme Court ruling, we have to have a moral and ethical call to all of us to prevent us from exercising our rights in ways that are so damaging to each other. So if you feel like something is different now than it was before, it really is different now. The NRA and that crowd, their fringy view for decades has become the law of the land and is a serious issue for anybody who wants to see gun safety. So if you feel like you're banging your head against the wall and you say, how come Sandy Hook and how come Moms Demand Action and how come these organizations we've mentioned today like Raw Tools and others can't get traction? The playing field changed and the rules changed significantly in 2008. So we have to have a more flexible way to deal with gun violence than what we're getting to. Now, does that mean we shouldn't ban assault rifles? I think we should, but that's going to face significant legal challenges. So we're in a tough spot in this country, and we have to address this when we talk specifically about access and use of guns and weapons and all the rest. The constitutional law niblets.
Show.
Yeah. So many things, right? There's so much to talk about. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for all of your good faithfulness and all the things that you do. And by the way, if you don't know all of our people, pastors and organizational leaders and all, look up all the bios for Dominique and for Stephany and for Laura, doing really, really great work. And hey, we'll see you all again next week. And those of you that like to hang around every day, we'll see you tomorrow morning, where Ani Zonneveld, who's the executive director of Muslims for Progressive Values, will be on. Her and I just released an op-ed today in Business Insider calling faith communities in the Christian tradition to take as seriously the need for de-radicalization as Muslim leaders were called to take seriously de-radicalization in their communities in the early 2000s. So we believe that there's a radicalization that has happened inside of churches and communities toward violence in this society. And we're calling for faith leaders to step up and to take that seriously. So that's the conversation tomorrow. And then Friday, we like to talk science and economics. So we're going to have an economics professor on to talk about our economy. So we want you to find common good resources and common good ways forward so that you can make the common good your life and voting criteria as you move forward. So Dominique, Stephany, Laura, thank you for all your goodness and for being a part of all of this. And friends, we will see you all tomorrow morning.